Deemed, rehabilitated, and real entertaining. This is the Carl Jackson Podcast.
Welcome to this Tuesday edition of the Carl Jackson Show podcast, your daily dose of objective truth in a world of confusion and lies. Today, I want to talk to you about I want to dive into reparations. There's all type of news happening, and we'll save that news. I'll be sitting in for the Officer Tatum throughout the entire week, and also in for Dr. Gorka, Lord willing, on Friday as well. So I'll get to a lot of the news of the day in those programs that I sit in for. But this week, I wanted to take time between Christmas and the New Year to focus on some issues that the left always try to throw at us, and I think we need to start fighting back against. One of those being reparations, and that's what I want to talk about today. This is going to be your ultimate anti-reparation podcast. All right, so I want you to brace yourself for this. I want you to take notes down, because I don't want any of you buying into this white guilt nonsense, or I don't want any of you buying into this idea that reparations are going to be good for Black people. Reparations in the United States of America, first off, they've already happened in the via affirmative action in academia, via racial quotas when it comes to corporate America. So we've already seen reparations at play, if you will, and that hasn't worked. The left continues to be mad, particularly Black leftists continue to be mad. And I would argue that reparations is bad for Blacks on a number of fronts. All right. For one, it keeps Blacks mad at people who didn't oppress them, who didn't oppress us. All right. And I think, I'm a Christian, I believe that that's a sin. Harboring animosity, harboring ill will. Now, that isn't to say that at times people do wrong you and they shouldn't be brought to justice. That's a different issue. But harboring hatred for an entire race of people based upon history that you didn't play a part in is a sin, in my opinion. That is wrong. You have a dark heart if you want to participate in that. Also, another thing that reparations will do and has done, in my opinion, it's actually rendered Blacks powerless. It's rendered Blacks victim. We've embraced this victim mentality that I too think is a sin, and we're beholden to big government and not to God. So, in other words, when we look at the plight of any Blacks in America today, we don't trace it back to God's union of man and woman and family, and that being abolished and systematically abolished by the Democrat Party. We look at the Republican Party oftentimes and said, hey, you did this, when in fact, it was the Democrat Party that perpetuated slavery in America, the KKK, so on, etc. So we'll get into those things. But it also ignores the spiritual gifts that God has given us and that we're going to be held accountable to God as Blacks and human beings, period. It doesn't matter what ethnicity you are. We're all going to stand in front of God. And that is a scary proposition, but we're all going to stand in front of God, and we're going to give an account for what we've done with the talents that he's given us. And you're not going to be able to say, well, Lord, I'm Black, so, hook a brother up. That isn't going to work in heaven. There's not going to be any affirmative action plan in heaven. So I think Blacks need to let go of this nonsense, this idea of reparations. We will get into the practicality of it as well. Also, what reparations does is make the Black community, or Black people, Black Americans, dependent on the Democratic Party. And what we end up doing is voting for Democrats overwhelmingly, because we expect Democrats to be our champions. It doesn't matter if Democrats bring results or not. What we want is for someone to feel sorry for us. The Democrat Party pretends to feel sorry for us. And since they feel sorry for us, we expect that they have our back. When in fact, if you look at the data, if you look at results, you will see that the Black family has been in decline since we've embraced Democratic policies. They're just not good for America. They're not good for the Black population specifically. And take a swig. Then there's a question of this. Who's entitled to reparations? What Black in America is entitled to reparations given the context of history? What about the slave trade that occurred with Europeans into the Ottoman Empire, where Northern Africans played a part in that? What do we do about that? Do Blacks owe Europeans reparations? These are things that we have to think about. What about the Blacks that sold Blacks into slavery in the Western Hemisphere? Do those black chiefs in Africa, do they need to pay reparations? Do we need to find their descendants to make sure they pay their reparations bill? Because if they did that, right, then there's going to be a lot of people frustrated and mad that your ancestors are going to be the ones that are actually paying the bill when it comes to reparations. But we need to look at slavery in the context of history. I've talked about some of this stuff before, but I want to add to it. I want to put more into play here so you have a lot to think about. So you have a lot to go, a lot of material to use against the left, because I think this reparations argument is completely silly. It won't do anything but keep blacks down. I know California Governor Gavin Newsom is looking to pay reparations to blacks that are supposed ancestors of slaves. How they'll be able to prove that, I have no idea why. I hear money's upwards of anywhere from $250,000 or $250,000 all the way up to $500,000. Here's the problem. Even if blacks were to get that, they wouldn't be satisfied. You know why? Because the money would run out. The money would run out, and then eventually what blacks would say is, okay, we need more. All the blacks that don't know how to handle money properly, just like many people don't know how to handle money properly, once that money runs out, then they're going to come and they're going to want more. Hence, that's why reparations in academia has not worked. All we've done is created a bunch of radical leftists when it comes to academia. A lot of these blacks that were sent to college, many because of their brains, but also many because of affirmative action. And sadly, many of them have been indoctrinated into straight up communism. I mean, it hasn't paid off well for us. And they've adopted a European style of communism, or white Marxism, which makes no freaking sense to me. So it's amazing what has happened. Again, the racial quotas in corporate America. Listen, there's no way to end with a reasonable conclusion when it comes to reparations, because again, you can't determine who owes what. How much we owe white Europeans that we put into slavery. How much is owed by the black chiefs that were put into slavery or put us into slavery, that sold us off to European and Arab slavers. There's no way to determine that. What about the people that came into the United States, the vast majority of whites that came into the United States after the war between the states, after the Civil War? There's no way to determine this. You're talking about, anyway, let's do this. Let's just get into some of the arguments. I'll get into these arguments in depth. I want you to have a gamut of information that you can just use as a machine gun, if you will, towards the left when they talk about this reparation stuff. But I think the first thing to start off with is affirmative action. Affirmative action, by the way, was a Republican plan, even though I disagree with it. At the time, I wouldn't say that I would have, but I definitely do now. But Richard Nixon, Art Fletcher, known as the father of affirmative action, a black Republican, they implemented this plan in our academia, higher education. It hasn't panned out well. I'm glad more blacks were able to go to college. Unfortunately, again, more blacks have come out of college being socialists and Marxists. So that hasn't boded well for America as a whole. But it was the Republican Party under the leadership of Richard Nixon and Art Fletcher that came up with plans for affirmative action in college. So first I want to make this argument. Hat tip to Michael Medved. He wrote a piece years ago, and I've talked about this before, that 6 Inconvenient Truths about the U.S. and slavery. I'm also going to cite some pieces from Thomas Sowell and Larry Elder, who wrote some great pieces on the issues of reparations and slavery. All right, so you have to understand this. So when America was founded in 1776, slavery was universal. It existed and it was accepted absolutely everywhere. Human beings took a major lead towards civilization with the domestication, believe it or not, of farm animals, whether it's cows, chickens, sheep, horses, oxen, you name it, goats. That's when domestication began to start, even with human beings. That was about 10,000 years ago. As crazy as that sounds, you have to understand that the way of the world has been brutal. It has been war. It has been brutality. It has been take concubines. It has been kill men and all this kind. It has just been brutal. So we always have to look at slavery in the context of history, of world history, not just American history as a whole. At the same time, that the domestication of animals began, they began domesticating. I know this sounds crazy, but this is the way of the world. This is important stuff to know. We can't, just because we live in America, in a modern day America, we can't say, the past doesn't apply to us. No, it's very important that we know these things, especially if we're going to talk about reparations. Especially if we're going to try to divvy up reparations that we consider to be fair. There's no way to figure out what's fair and what's not. The best thing to do is drop it, squash it, forgive, move on, because it makes no sense to pay reparations to a person that has never been a slave and to get paid by a person who has never been a slaveholder. And that's just stupid. That's just silly. And the left wants you to believe there's some validity to it. There is no validity to it. What the left needs to do, and what they're trying to do constantly, is to remove God, right? Let's say this, they've actually already removed God out of the culture. So they're looking for ways to worship a new God. They're looking for ways to feel virtuous. They're looking for ways to feel moral. And one of the ways that the left can feel moral is by constantly calling Republicans racist. Republicans who, by the way, fought against the KKK, which was the anti-freedom movement of the Democrat Party, killing black and white Republicans alike. They were a terrorist organization that were created to squash Republicans. That's what the KKK was or is. That's what they were made of. It was a democratic terrorist organization. Now, their membership existed in the millions at the turn of the 20th century. They dwindled all the way down to the low thousands, around 2000-ish, somewhere in that range. So they're not a major threat. They're not a major threat. Are they evil, disgusting people? Sure, absolutely. Can they stop blacks from progressing and being successful in America? The answer is absolutely no. So we go back to this issue of domestication. So at the same time that animals were beginning to be domesticated, so were human beings. And this domestication even meant ownership. It meant slavery. I'm sorry to tell you, that's just the way the world was. Humans were captured as prisoners of war. And these prisoners of war were often used as slaves, maids, servants, concubines, so on, etc., or by the people that captured them. Romans captured so many Eastern Europeans. Did you hear this? Romans captured so many Eastern Europeans that the term Slav and slave have the same origins. Now, you talk about the Aboriginals, or you talk about Native Americans. Okay, well, Carl, look at what we did to Native Americans. They didn't deserve that. These evil white people came to these lands, which are known as America or the Americas, and we abolished the Native American people. Well, listen, we know that what abolished the Native American people, many of them, sadly, were diseases and illnesses that none of us had a clue of. Look at how stupid our experts are when it comes to COVID today. Imagine when technology didn't exist, people just meeting each other for the first time, and they're like, "Oh my God, who are you? Your skin is darker. Oh, your skin is paler." They shake, they meet, they swap ideas and so on, etc. They had no idea that these certain people had bacteria, that they were exposed to that would end up killing many of the people they just met. That's not genocide. It's not genocide takes a premeditated and intentional act, meeting a group of people and unfortunately getting them sick where they died. That's not genocide. It's sad, but it isn't genocide. That isn't to say that some bad things didn't happen with the Native Americans. They did. But the Native Americans are not without excuse. The Native Americans are not innocent themselves. Let's talk about the Mayas, the Aztecs, and the Incas. They were amongst the most brutal slave traders of all. The most brutal slave masters when they conquered members of other tribes. It's what they did. Why? Because it was the way of the world. No one was innocent. You get my point? Slavery was universal. No one is innocent. So how do you determine reparations? Again, the Mayas, the Aztecs, the Incas were the most brutal of them all. They engaged in limitless human sacrifice. They were sick. They were twisted. I'm sorry, but that was the way of the world. That was the way things existed. That was the way people existed. The Tupanuma tribe, or Tupanamba tribe, they were on the coast of Brazil, south of the Amazon. They took slaves. They would humiliate their slaves in all types of ways for months or sometimes even years before they would murder them in masses by eating them. That's right. Cannibalism. So don't come to me and say that, oh, these white people. I'm sorry to tell you, some of the most brutal slave masters were the Native Americans, were Arabs, all right, and were Aboriginals. They were the most brutal. I'm not sitting here to blow smoke up your butt. That's just a fact. That's just a fact. So what do we do about them? What do we do about them? What do we do about the slavery that existed on American territory as a result of them? What do we do about the slave trade as far as reparations when it comes to Native American people? What do we do? What do we do? I mean, it's amazing. Did you know that Africans or that Native Americans even owned African slaves? How did they get to own African slaves? What happened? I mean, so no one is innocent. You know, here's what you have to take into account. The world, including America, was a very brutal place to live in. It was a very evil and dark place. Yes, it had its periods of enlightenment, but the world, by and large, was an evil and dark place. That's why America stands as a sitting and a shining city on the hill. That's why the rest of the world is so eager to take America down, because America serves as a mirror to a lot of the world. So does Israel in the Middle East. They serve as a mirror to the rest of the world, and they hate us. That's why we're known as the big Satan, and Israel is known as the little Satan. Nobody deserves reparations. Everybody should be begging God for forgiveness. If we're going to look at our ancestral sins, everyone should be down on their knees, begging God for forgiveness. That's the truth. Africans enslaved other Africans long before Europeans came into the picture. That's just a fact. And again, you had the North African slave trade. What do we do about the Europeans that were sold into slavery thanks to Arabs and Africans? What do we do about that? How much do we owe them? Do we owe them more than they owe us? These are things that have to be pondered. And this is why it's not worth having a serious conversation over, especially when it comes to the left. Because this is nothing more than a way to keep black people angry, mad, and down so that they can keep the black vote. It has nothing to do with wanting to help black people. Do you think black people that are poor as hell, that live in the hood, they get $250,000, $500,000, or somehow their lives are going to turn around, their attitudes are going to change completely, they're going to start loving white people, and that's not going to happen. That's not human nature, sadly. Again, most people that don't know how to handle money, it's just like lottery winners. You give them 250 grand, you give them $500,000. If they don't know how to be faithful in the little, which the Bible explains, right? If they don't know how to be faithful with little, they're not going to do it good with much. That money is going to be spent, just like Faison Love said, the comedian, on Cadillacs, Mercedes, and everything else. The money's going to be gone. And then what? Oh, we want more. We want more. We want more. Just look at affirmative action, right? In academia, look at the racial quotas. Look at every freaking commercial you turn on now. They either black people or gay people. It never works. They're never satisfied, and they never will be satisfied because they need God. It's really as simple as that. They need God. Larry Elder wrote an excellent column at the Heritage Foundation, and he talked about the movie The Woman King and this Dahomey tribe. Let me just read parts of it. He says, these are the facts when it comes to American slavery. Though horrific, it was legal. It ended 157 years ago. The government did not own slaves. It was the private sector that did. So how can you say reparations, from the federal government? You can't. Most Southerners didn't own slaves. And I'll get into more specific numbers on that. Nearly all slave owners were Democrats. So why should non-Democrats pay reparations? That's another great point. Then when it comes to reparations and people paying reparations, why should any Republicans pay reparations, especially if you can trace your party loyalty back to your ancestry and back to the Civil War? If they were Union soldiers, why should any Republican pay reparations? This is another fantastic reason that Larry Elder brings up. Which is why this whole concept of reparations is stupid. Hundreds of thousands of white Northerners lost their lives and suffered serious injuries, he writes, fighting in the Civil War that ended slavery. Hey, guys, listen, before I go on, I want to make sure that I ask you to please subscribe to the podcast wherever podcasts are found, Apple, Google, Spotify, YouTube, and Rumble. You can find me on social media, The Carl Jackson Show. And don't forget to please support my sponsors. Without my sponsors, none of this is possible. For a limited time, you can go to watchepic.com watchepic.com/Carl Jackson. You can subscribe there to watch Epic TV. And I make sure you do it. They're unbiased. They report important news that other media ignore. They're truthful. They report just the facts and trust that and trust their viewers to discern fact from fiction. All right. They're resilient despite the efforts and attacks from many sides, many others in the media, defamation from other media members, thugs burning their printing presses. You can trust Epic TV. You can learn more about or watch Larry Elder's television show right there on Epic TV. So please go to watchepic.com/Carl Jackson and subscribe today. And also don't forget My Pillow. Though Christmas season is over, there's still plenty of deals to be had. All you have to do is go to mypillow.com. Click on that radio listener square. Use my name as a promo code Carl, or give them a call, 1-800-858-0263. 1-800-858-0263, and use the promo code Carl. Also, don't forget my friends at the Patriot Gold Group. Listen, the economy, it sucks, and it's going to get even worse. If you want to put a small portion of your portfolio, invest in gold to make sure that it doesn't crash, please visit my friends at the Patriot Gold Group. Major banks are forecasting a 25% stock market plunge. The only break in inflation is through a recession. Rich Dad, Poor Dad author Robert Kiyosaki said the economy is the biggest bubble in history. Kiyosaki bought more gold, predicting $3,000 an ounce in a year. Billionaire economists agree that we're heading toward a recession and investors need to buy gold. So call the Patriot Gold Group today, por favor. Mention the Carl Jackson Show. You'll get the best in-class service from patriots that are protecting other patriots. Give them a call. The number is 888-534-3665. That is 888-534-3665 for a free investor guide today. So please check them out if you want to invest in gold and secure a little bit of your retirement under this crazy administration. Okay, let me take a swig here. Excuse me. Okay, so getting back to this column with Larry Elder, he talks about this movie that came out with the Woman King. All right, Viola Davis played the lead role in that. But another thing he says, hundreds of thousands of white Northerners lost their lives. They suffered serious injuries fighting in the Civil War that ended slavery. And that today, as conservative writer Michael Medved puts it, only about 5% of whites bear any generational guilt to slavery. I'll get into that more in just a second. Then there's the role that Africa itself played in the slave trade. And guys, you need to understand, black people, you need to understand, white liberals, you need to understand that the slave trade didn't look like, what was it? Man, what was that series with Kunta Kinte? Roots. It didn't look like Roots. Whites weren't going on to the continent of Africa and catching blacks with a butterfly net. You got to be silly to believe that nonsense. But that's what Hollywood wants to do. That's what the leftists, the liberals in Hollywood want to do, because their party is closely associated with the slave trade. So that's what they want to do. But the truth of the matter is, it was blacks capturing blacks and selling blacks to other to Europeans and to Arabs. That's what they were doing. Not to mention, the vast majority of slaves existed in Africa, amongst other Africans, owned by other Africans, just like here with Native Americans, because of war. Tribes would war against other tribes, and they would take other tribes members as their slaves. That was the way of the world. And we like to pretend in America, because we have it so good and we're so spoiled, that this wasn't the way of the world, that we are the evil people of the world. No, actually, slavery exists at least here. I hate to break the news to you, but it's true. Slavery was the least prevalent here in the United States of America. That's just a fact. That's just a fact. So if you're going to be pissed, you should be pissed at everyone else. But the truth is, you can't be pissed at Africans, because you know they're going to say, shut up. I'm going to give you jack squat. They're not dumb like white liberals. Hate to say it, but that's a fact. Africans won't play that game at all. So they had this movie, The Woman King, starring Viola Davis, and this was about African female warriors. Larry Elder goes on to say, portrays white slavers as villains and the female warriors as anti-slavery avengers. The film claims that it is inspired by true events, but sadly, that's not true. IMDb describes its plot as a historical epic inspired by true events that took place in the kingdom of Dahomey, one of the most powerful states of Africa in the 18th and 19th centuries. All right. But is it really inspired by true events? Larry Elder takes a stab at it. He says there was, in fact, a band of warrior women in Africa called the Dahomey. That is true. They were fierce. They were fierce. They were feared and bloodthirsty fighters. But they used that ferocity to kill and conquer other Africans for sale to slave traders. So the movie was just a straight up lie. And that's what Hollywood does, because Hollywood is interested in creating money and interested in creating victims and interested in keeping blacks on their side. It's political. It's not truth. That's me talking. Going back to Elder's column, the transatlantic African slave trade and the Arab African slave trade could not have occurred without the complicity of African chiefs who sold conquered Africans to European and Arab slavers. In the film, white slavers are portrayed as the enemy when in reality they were business partners with the women kings. So these people, these chicks with the women king or the women kings, were actually capturing their own people and selling them to Europeans and Arabs. And I got to be honest with you, they didn't look in defense of the Dahomeys. They didn't look as other tribes as their people. Blacks in America, we look at each other. Oh man, he's black. He's black. We have no idea what tribes we may have or we may be descendants of. But in Africa, they don't view just because you're black, you're one of us. The same would be true with Europeans. There's different countries, regions, and so on in Europeans. Well, and in Africa, in a place where there are lots of tribes in different regions, they looked at blacks the same way. Just because you're the same skin color doesn't mean jack squat. We're the only ones dumb enough to do that in America. But what made America great is what our founder said is this is going to be a melting pot, this great experiment. And regardless of where you came from, regardless of your beginnings, we're all going to be Americans. That is going to be our national identity. It was the first time that's been tried in human history, and it's been a success, except for the left that is trying to destroy it. So even though we came from different parts of the world, we're all one family, and that we're e pluribus unum, from many one. From many nations, ethnicities, but we're all Americans when we arrive on this land. That's fascinating. That's never happened in human history. That's what makes America so good. That's what makes America unique. By the way, the Dahomey tribe, these warriors, they were women. And listen, this is just a fact. They were women that the chiefs considered so ugly, they didn't want to sleep with them. So they made them warriors, and they became valiant warriors for the chiefs. That's just a fact. That's just truth. A lot of people don't like truth, but that is just the truth. All right. So again, African traders like the Dahomeys, when they sold people, for them, it wasn't, oh, we're selling our own kind. They were like, nah, screw you. You're not from our tribe. I don't care if you have the same color skin. Doesn't matter to me. That's the way the world was. All right. That's the way the world was. But The Woman King, that movie it's not a depiction of a true story. A real life tribe, sure, but not a depiction of a true story. They were actually selling Africans. They weren't these warriors that were protecting them from whites. It's just not true. The African American historian Nathan Huggins wrote, and I quote, "Virtually all of the enslavement of Africans was carried out by other Africans." And it makes sense. They were on the continent. But the concept of the African race, that was an invention of Western colonists. That was an invention of the West. That's why you'll hear some people say there is no race except the human race. All right. So the concept of race was an invention of Western colonists. So African traders saw themselves as selling people that were not their own, despite their skin color. Now you have to consider America. You have to consider the colonial North America only received approximately 5 to 6% of the African slaves shipped across the Atlantic. Now, this isn't I'm not saying this to minimize what happened. The concept of slavery is evil and it is cruel. And by the way, slavery is more widespread today than it's ever been in world history, but you don't hear anybody talking about it. We'll get into that shortly. But the Arab slave trade, mostly from East Africa, lasted longer and enslaved more humans than European slavers. So what do we do about that? What do we do about that? Islamic society shipped anywhere from 12 to 17 million African slaves in the course of 1,000 years. That's not saying how many they kept. That's just how many 12 to 17 million Africans that they shipped away to make money off of in the course of 1,000 years. God knows how many African slaves the Arabs kept around. The number of Africans enslaved by Europeans amounts to approximately 11 million. So the number is far less, even though it's still a high number, it's still far less. 97% of American men, women, and children that were kidnapped and sold into slavery weren't sent to America. You understand that, right? So that means 97% of Africans, women, and children sold into slavery weren't here. Where were they? Where should 97% of that reparations money come from, Black Americans? This is just a fact. I'm tired. Listen, I just get so tired of people that want to be victims. You know, especially if you claim to know God. You shouldn't sit there looking for ways to be a victim, looking for ways to help, to hate on others. It's just a sick place to be. It's a sad place to be. I would say that I feel sorry for you, except you're screwing America up for everybody. And it's a little frustrating. Slavery in America, albeit cruel and evil, it was brief. It was brief in the context of history. It was limited in its localities, and only a tiny percentage of Americans, as we've already explained, participated in the slave trade. So how would you make that ancestral connection? You get approximately 5% of Americans who you can tie any ancestral connection to. That's very hard to do. I mean, considering the 13th Amendment in 1865, I believe it was, America, in 89 short years after we became a country, we ended it. 157 years have passed. So consider this. We established America in 1776, not 1619, like the fake little liars that want to be victims, Black victims that want to constantly perpetuate this nonsense and constantly be victims, even though they go to higher institutions of learning and make a buttload of money. They always want to be perceived as victims. It's amazing to me. But when America was established, it took us 89 years to get rid of slavery in America. Considering the rest of the world took thousands of years, that's a pretty good track record. And again, that's not to excuse slavery. But the truth is, the reason why we're so knowledgeable about slavery in America is because we have free speech, unlike other nations who, if they tried to challenge their leaders, would be killed. God, it's insane. Insane. The importation of slaves ended even sooner in 1808. Did you know that? So it became illegal to import slaves into America in 1808. So that's only 32 years after our Declaration of Independence. Slavery was outlawed in most states long before, decades before the Civil War. 80% of whites in the South didn't even own slaves. So again, you have 5 to 6% of people involved in the slave trade. 3% of the slaves came to the colonial North America, but 80% of whites in the South didn't own slaves. The vast majority of whites that live in America today are descendants of legal immigrants. Legal immigrants who arrived in America after the Civil War, predominantly through Ellis Island. So you're trying to ask or demand reparations from a bunch of white people that had nothing to do with the North American slave trade. Do you understand how this breaks down? You understand why this nonsense, this reparations argument is absolutely stupid as we break this stuff down? It's insane. 5% of Americans, this is of 2007, had any generational connection whatsoever to slavery. 5% of Americans. So you can have that argument with reparations with 5% of Americans, but then even when it comes to that 5% of Americans, you have to ask the question, all of these questions. Okay, how do we figure this out if your Black chiefs sold to my family members. They're going to have to figure out some math. It's probably a wash. And then you have subsequent Jim Crow laws. You have the economic oppression and discrimination that were tools that were used primarily by Democrats to stifle the success of blacks in America. Then they lied about a big switch that happened. How do you figure out reparations when it comes to all of that stuff? It's absolutely insane. It's insane where we are. There's a few more points that I want to bring up. By the way, slavery wasn't genocidal. Live slaves were valuable, but dead slaves brought no profit. As evil and as crazy as it sounds, this is the truth. Slavery wasn't genocidal because genocide, by definition, it has to be an intentional act. These slave traders, as evil as they were, they wanted to make money off of black African slaves. The only way that they could make money off of their slaves was to make sure that they not only arrived, but they arrived in great health, and so that they could sell them for high prices and make money. I know it sounds evil, but this was the way of the world. This isn't just America. Remember, this is Native Americans. This is how Africans did Africans. We just happened to travel across the Atlantic, sadly, where estimated a third of slaves died on that transport, which is very sad and sickening. But that's the truth. That's the truth. So again, how do you determine reparations when you're talking about genocide when there was no genocide, when the goal was to make sure that Africans arrived here safely and in good health so that the slave traders could make good money? It's not true that the U.S. became a wealthy nation through the abuse of slave labor. The most prosperous states in the country were those that first freed their slaves. Michael Medved wrote, Pennsylvania passed an emancipation law in 1780. Connecticut and Rhode Island followed 4 years later, all before the Constitution. New York approved the emancipation in 1799. These states, with dynamic banking centers in Philadelphia and Manhattan, quickly emerged as robust centers of commerce and manufacturing, greatly enriching themselves, while the slave-based economies in the South sucked in comparison. At the time of the Constitution, Virginia constituted the most populous and wealthiest state in the Union. But by the time of the war between the states, or the Civil War, Virginia had fallen far behind a half dozen northern states that had outlawed slavery to generations earlier. In other words, those in the South, those that were still participating in the slave trade, even though it wasn't foreign at the time, but within the boundaries of the United States of America, they were languishing. Their industries were languishing. They were doing the same old crap. They weren't being innovative. They depended so much on the backs of slaves that, when slaves die, get sick, or the industry, they found new ways of technology, modernizing, even, the cotton machine, all this kind of stuff. The slaves became slowly but surely obsolete. And so it isn't true. I feel bad because I know there's a lot of black people that want to believe this, and they'll argue, well, we built America. Well, damn it. If you built America, first off, you should want to stay here and you should want to do everything to prop it up. But the truth is we didn't. The truth is there were some evil people that participated in the slave trade all the way from Africa, all the way to North America. That's the truth. And we were part of the victims of that, or our ancestors were. But that's the truth. That's the truth. You don't deserve reparations. No one deserves reparations. This world was an evil place. And the fact that people would even ask for reparations tells me that they need to beg for forgiveness from God. The fact that you would want to put other people in that type of financial bondage, you got to be a sick, evil person yourself, in my opinion. But these are things that we have to consider. No, blacks didn't build America. It's just not true. It's not true. You had Asian people working in the West on the train rails. It's just not true. I know we like to build up these. We like to make ourselves feel better as Black Americans by building up these myths. But you know what? You know what would make our lives better if we embraced God, if we embraced the Bible, if we embraced God's principles, if we embraced family, the traditional family. Again, that's what will make the Black community better. While America deserves no unique blame for the existence of slavery, the United States merits special credit for its rapid abolition. Again, I gave you the numbers. Even though slavery existed here, we cut it out pretty quickly. 89 years after our founding. Brazil didn't cut out slavery until several years after we ended slavery here. I forget how long it was, but several years after we ended slavery, Brazil finally ended slavery. And you got to take into account the people like Spain, Portugal, the Dutch, all of these merchants, long before the settlement of English North America, that contributed to the slave trade. What do you do about the Spaniards? What do you do about the Dutch? What do you do about the Portuguese? What do you do about the Arabs? How much do they owe? How much do they owe? How much do they owe? How much do Native Americans owe? How much do Africans owe? Because actually whites played the least. White Europeans in America played the smallest role when it comes to the slave trade. That's just a fact, Jack. That's just a fact. Call me any name you want, but I'm here spreading the truth. It's as simple as that. I don't want people to be victims. I believe that blacks, God put us on this earth for a reason, just like he put everybody else on this earth for a reason. And we have God-given talents that we're supposed to be using. And that's what we should be doing, not looking for ways to remain victims. We're victors, all right? We're victors in Christ. We're not victims. So we should be looking ways to use the gifts and the talents that God has given us. And I understand sometimes that's hard to sort out. It's hard to find, but we don't sit and blame whites and blame others as an excuse for things that we haven't done. Thomas Sowell on slavery wrote, he talked about that there are more slaves today than there were seized from Africa in 4 centuries. Incidentally, the September 2023 issue of National Geographic, actually, this is a guy by the name of Mark J. Perry, but it's speaking of stuff that Thomas Sowell wrote. He says, incidentally, the September 2003 issue of National Geographic had an article about the millions of people that are still enslaved around the world right now. But he asked, where's the moral outrage or moral indignation about that? According to the National Geographic article titled 21st Century Slaves, there are an estimated 27 million men, women, and children in the world who are enslaved. 27 million. Physically confined or restrained and forced to work or controlled through violence or in some way treated as property. We got a slave trade at the southern border right now that the Democrat Party is unleashing on America. What are we going to do about that? That's why I don't take the left seriously. When they talk about reparations, it's honestly time for us to push back against this stuff. It's time for us to stop being wimps when the Democrat Party and the left, the Democratic left, say reparations. That no, we don't owe anybody anything. We don't owe anybody anything. Get yourself a job. There's your reparations. You live in America. Go get a freaking job. Millions of people out of the labor force. Go get a freaking job. There's your reparations. You get to live in the greatest country that God has ever given man. You're the ones responsible for screwing it up by voting for politicians that will let illegal aliens in that compete against your jobs, that'll compete for your jobs. So there's your reparations. Close the freaking border and get a job. There's your reparations. There you go. I like that, Gabe. I like that conclusion. How about you? All right. So that's reparations in my opinion. That's reparations. Thomas Sowell also wrote, of all the tragic facts about the history of slavery, the most astonishing to an American today is that although slavery was a worldwide institution for thousands of years, nowhere in the world was slavery a controversial issue prior to the 18th century. People of every race and color were enslaved and enslaved others. White people were still being bought and sold as slaves in the Ottoman Empire decades after American blacks were freed. What do we do about that? Everyone hated the idea of being a slave, but few had any qualms about enslaving others. Slavery was just not an issue, not even among intellectuals, much less among political leaders until the 18th century. And then it was the issue only in Western civilization. So it was Western civilization that said, wait a minute. Yes, we own slaves. This just doesn't feel right. This doesn't sit right with our spirit, with our soul. What do we do about this? That was the Western civilization. Amongst the people who turned against slavery were some that were slave owners. Some of our founders, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and other American leaders. Sowell writes, you could research all of the 18th century Africa or Asia or the Middle East without finding any comparable rejection of slavery there. But who is singled out for scathing criticism today? It's American leaders of the 18th century. It's crazy. Guys, we don't owe Jack. Blacks don't deserve Jack. Nobody owes Jack. No one owes reparations. The only reason California is doing it is to virtue signal. They're starting to lose black and other minority votes, and they got to do everything and anything possible to keep blacks trapped on the Democrat plantation. They don't want them to go anywhere, even if that means paying them a bunch of money that they don't have to pay. And eventually these blacks are going to have to pay the money back in taxes anyway, especially if you live in California. It's a fake. It's a fraud. I know the idea of making money sounds great, but I guarantee you what's going to happen if these payouts are made to people in California. The money is going to be blown, and then it's only going to take a short amount of time before the people are saying, hey, we want more, we want more, we want more. Don't buy into it. Guys, listen. I appreciate you tuning in to this edition of the Carl Jackson Show podcast. Please subscribe to my podcast wherever podcasts are found. You can go to Apple, Google, Spotify, YouTube, and Rumble. Please subscribe to our YouTube and Rumble page. In all seriousness, we really do appreciate that. It really does help with the numbers, just being honest with you when you watch, when you like, when you review, when you subscribe, obviously. So please do that. We would very much so appreciate it. Follow me on social media, The Carl Jackson Show. Please help my sponsors, Patriot Gold Group. Again, mention the Carl Jackson Show. You will get the best in-class service from patriots that are protecting patriots. You can call 888-534-3665 for your free investor guide today. All right. So don't forget about them. Also, if you want to subscribe to Epic TV, again, you can go to watchepic.com/Carl Jackson. That is watchepic.com/Carl Jackson and subscribe. Plenty of shows, including programs like Crossroads, The Larry Elder Show, Facts Matter, American thought leaders, and documentaries that are investigating critical issues that aren't covered anywhere else in media. They're unbiased. They're truthful. They're resilient. Check them out. Watchepic.com/Carl Jackson. And don't forget My Pillow. Still plenty of deals available, up to 80% off in some cases. All you have to do is go to mypillow.com, click on that radio listener square, answer my name, Carl, C-A-R-L, or give them a call, 1-800-858-0263. And until next time, guys, don't grow weary doing good. God bless you.